Everyone is lying to you about inflation. The left says it's from corporate greed, the right says it's from deficit spending. They're both wrong, and they know it. Biden is not directly responsible for inflation, but guess what? Neither is Trump. Now that I know I've made you angry, let me go one step further. You're gonna have to watch this whole video to get the answer. We are gonna go through the history of inflation, how it's caused, how it's managed today, and what we can do to eliminate it for good. Let's go. My name is Matt Latimer, and this is Imagine Better. First, we need to define inflation. Inflation is not rising prices. Inflation is a decrease in value of your money. Rising prices are just a symptom, not the cause. Keep that in mind as we go through the history. Inflation has existed as long as money's been around, so we're going to do a lightning round of historical examples before we dive into US history. First, we have ancient Rome. From Nero onward, Rome kept mixing in less valuable metals into their silver coins, thus increasing the monetary supply and making their money worth less. Ancient China switched from metallic money to paper money, printing more and more as needed, causing it to be worth less. Mansa Musa brought so much gold to Egypt that he single-handedly increased the supply of their money, making it worth less. After discovering the Americas, Spain imported so much gold and silver from the Americas that it increased the supply in Europe, driving down the price and making it worth less. Recent history gets even crazier with inflation. Once countries switch to paper money not backed by anything, they can just keep printing and printing money. You even see countries go through what we call hyperinflation, where inflation hits over 50% a month. The most prominent example of hyperinflation is the Weimar Republic. Germany, after World War I, had an indemnity payment and had to balance their budget. But instead of balancing it, they just kept printing more and more paper, making their money worth less. So it's pretty evident that money supply drives inflation. Yes, theoretically, money demand can also drive inflation, but that usually doesn't happen until after the inflation cycle has already begun. There are no significant examples of inflation caused by a drop in money demand. So now that we've finished our world history lightning round, let's dive into the US's history of inflation. We actually start off our country with a period of inflation. The Continental Congress printed so much continental currency that it eventually became worthless. After learning that lesson, the country turned to a system of competing currencies. Yes, the federal government still minted coins, but those never reached a significant level of circulation. During this time, state-chartered banks issued over 1,000 of their own private currencies. These currencies each had their own individual inflation rate. The ones that had a high inflation rate ended up dying off, and the ones that were stable ended up gaining a larger market share. People started companies that carry out a lot of the functions that the government does today, such as lender of last resort, deposit insurance, and even clearinghouses. Now, the US did have several national banks during this period, but they were not central banks. They were private banks owned in part by the federal government. And yes, these banks did issue national currencies, but they had to compete with all of the other currencies just like everyone else did. The Bank of North America, the First National Bank, and the Second National Bank were the three national banks of the United States. Still, eventually, they were all sold to private investors. This system ended with the advent of the Civil War. The US ran out of money and passed two laws that changed American history. The first, in 1861, allowed Congress to print money that wasn't backed by metal. The second, in 1862, was a legal tender law that required all people to accept that money as payments for debts. From here, the US started massively centralizing the banking system. They imposed a 10% tax on any state-chartered bank currencies. Then, they created nationally chartered banks, which had to follow stricter and more uniform regulations. They also required all nationally chartered banks' currencies to be backed by a specific amount of gold, to be designed so they looked exactly the same, and to be all interchangeable. The US had created a national currency in all but name. Then in 1913, the US created the Federal Reserve System, which deserves a video all its own. Long story short, the Fed had the power to change the money supply, regulate banks, and be the lender of last resort to failing banks. However, there was one thing that was still holding the Fed back, and that was the gold standard. The Fed couldn't print money unless they had the gold to back it up. World War I gave the Fed all the gold it needed. Because Europe was in a war that needed massive financing, most countries dropped the gold standard and started wildly printing money. Dropping the gold standard drove gold to American markets, drastically increasing the money supply and causing yet another round of double-digit inflation. By this point, the US had so much of the world's gold, around 40% or so, that by the time World War II came around, this effect was much less. That all changed in 1971. Since the beginning of the Fed, anyone could exchange a dollar for a certain amount of gold. That pegged the US dollar to the price of gold. But throughout World War I and World War II, almost every other country abandoned that exchange rate. Because of the gold standard, the US dollar became the currency used worldwide as a store of value and to trade on international markets. It had no competition. And because it didn't have competition, the Fed cheated. The Federal Reserve had printed 4 times the amount of dollars that the US had in gold reserves. That's more than any central bank had in gold combined. The gold standard was dead, and the Fed killed it. All that was left was for the world to find out. In 1971, President Nixon signed a bill taking the US off the gold standard, preventing a run on the nation's reserves. The inflation of the 1970s didn't happen because of OPEC and oil. It happened because the money supply was 4 times higher than the world thought. To make matters worse, in 1977, Congress gave the Federal Reserve a dual mandate to not only stabilize prices, but to also minimize unemployment. Unfortunately, with monetary policy, those two goals are opposite, and the Federal Reserve decided to minimize unemployment, thus printing more money and causing the worst round of inflation that the US had seen since the Civil War. That brings us to today. As you can see, we can explain all of these inflation case studies with an increase in the money supply. So what does the money supply look like today? Before the COVID lockdown in February of 2020, the M1 money supply was $3.9 trillion. In June of 2020, the M1 money supply was $16.6 trillion. That's where our inflation comes from. 2020 has seen the largest increase of the money supply in the entire history of the Federal Reserve. The scary part is that $4 trillion of that has yet to even hit the market. Since 2009, one way the Federal Reserve has controlled money supply is creating bank accounts where banks can deposit money and receive risk-free interest. Right now, those bank accounts hold $4 trillion and are paying out $200 billion of interest annually. That means that on top of the inflation we see today, there's much more to come. So that's the history. But what's the problem with inflation? Inflation first hurts people who hold cash, whether physically or in a bank account. It almost acts as a tax on those people for saving. But in my opinion, the more significant effect is that it depresses wages. Even with relatively low inflation, around 2%, you still have workers who must go to ask for a raise to even make the same amount that they made the previous year. In a world without inflation, workers could fight for raises that would actually increase their salary. So what's the solution here? Many people say the answer is a gold standard, but we've seen throughout history that gold can also experience inflation. We need a system that has fully stable money. The first step is to remove the Fed's dual mandate. We need the Fed to focus on stable prices, not unemployment. The next step is to strip the Federal Reserve down to its bones, where it can only affect the money supply through buying and selling government bonds. Then it needs to target an inflation rate of 0%. Then the US should repeal legal tender laws, allowing consumers and producers to use and accept whichever currencies they want. Alternative currencies will provide competition for the US dollar and keep the Fed honest. Don't worry, as long as the Fed keeps the inflation rate at 0 and you still have to pay federal taxes using the US dollar will remain the world's reserve currency. But if the government lies, then the private market can step in and do a better job. So what do you think? Are competing currencies too confusing? Let me know in the comments. If you made it to the end, thank you so much, and here's how you can help us. First, you can click the like button and the subscription button and notification button if you're on YouTube. Then you can go into the show notes of this video and follow Imagine Better Media on all of the social media platforms you use regularly. After that, share us with as many people as possible, both online and in person. Finally, you can go to imaginebettermedia.com and sign up for one of our subscriptions. Thank you to our VIP subscribers who help make these videos possible. Let's imagine better and make it happen. And while you're here, you can click here to check out some of our other stories.